Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
Very intense and very serious. That's how Iran is describing high-stakes talks with the U.S. in Geneva today. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz. Joe Matthew will be back on air later this afternoon as we're awaiting details on whether or not progress is made in these talks that could avert potential military action. We'll have more this hour with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House, and check in on what this means for energy markets with Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy. Plus, there's more than one set of talks happening in Ukraine today, or in Geneva. There's also talks happening on Ukraine between Ukrainian officials and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. We'll have more on that with Angela Stent of the American Enterprise Institute. And our political panel will be here this hour as well. So we have a lot to get to, but we also have to get to these markets because NVIDIA is down and it's taken a lot down with it. So for a check on that, we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey Leinz. Absolutely right about NVIDIA. Shares trading lower now by 4.5%. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, they're all lower. S&P very close to session lows, down now by 1.1%. We've got the stocks, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Stock Index down 4.1%. S&P down 75, again down 1.1%. The Dow is down 0.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 1.8%. The NASDAQ 100 Index down 1.7%. And the Bloomberg Mag 7 Index, of which NVIDIA is a part, down 1.9%. Again, NVIDIA down now by 4.5%. Spot gold is up $3 the ounce, little changed, up under 0.1%, 51.68 the ounce. 10-year at 4.01% with a 2-year 3.44%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 1.6% right now, 66.45, as investors keep an eye on rapidly moving developments out of the Middle East. Again, recapping here, we do have NVIDIA shares trading lower, down 4.7%. Those losses in part on doubts that booming AI-related spending can be maintained. Also out with earnings, though, heading in the other direction, Salesforce up now by 2.8%. It did give a strong outlook for long-term sales, also announced a large share buyback. Recapping, S&P down by 1.1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here she is, Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. It's round 3 of talks between the U.S. and Iran in Geneva today, with just days to go until President Trump's self-imposed deadline for Tehran to make a deal over its nuclear program or risk potential military action from the United States, which, of course, is amassing great military force in the region, as we have seen in recent weeks. And while the president said once again in his State of the Union address just this Tuesday that he would prefer diplomacy prevail, it does seem the administration is starting to move the goalposts a little bit in terms of what they would like diplomacy to ultimately achieve, what kind of deal they ultimately want reached. Perhaps not just about the nuclear program, but maybe other things like ballistic missiles as well. Just take a listen to the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, from yesterday.
The negotiations tomorrow and the talks tomorrow will be largely focused on the nuclear program. And we hope progress can be made, because that's the president's preference, to make progress on the diplomatic front. But it's also important to remember that Iran refuses to talk about the ballistic missiles.
So we want to get more on this as we turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House. And usually I would say Tyler's on the White House North Lawn for us, but she's actually been moving about a little bit because there's also some high-profile visitors to the White House today that Tyler is trying to catch. Tyler, have you seen New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani or the Netflix CEO yet?
No, not yet. And if you're joining us on Bloomberg television, you'll probably see my head is on a swivel as we are waiting for these two potential high-profile visits here today. Reports that the New York City Mayor Mamdani will be here. We're not totally sure exactly what he will be discussing with President Trump, but amid reports that the Netflix CEO Ted Sarandos will be here as well, we have probably a clearer picture on what he would like to talk to with this White House, including its bid for a Warner Brothers acquisition, as well as you know, Kailey, President Trump in the last week calling on Netflix to remove from its board Susan Rice, a former Biden and Obama administration official, threatening that there could be consequences. You might have seen in the past week, Susan Rice had said on a podcast that Democrats will remember those media corporations and law firms and companies that, quote, bent the knee to the Trump administration. The Netflix CEO, in an interview on the BBC, shrugged off these concerns, saying that this is a business deal, not a political deal. But of course, this is all just underscoring the political dynamic to any potential acquisition.
Well, Tyler, as we are looking out, or you specifically are looking out, and I'm making sure I'm keeping an eye on the feed for you. I'll holler if I see anyone you need to go and talk to. But we know that President Trump, in addition to these meetings today, also is probably going to be kept abreast of what's happening in Geneva in the talks between the U.S. and Iran. Just talk to us about what kind of deal the president is now looking for. Is this going to be just a deal over the nuclear program, or is this now about something much beyond that and for a much longer period of time, perhaps, if Steve Witkoff is to be believed, an indefinite deal?
Right. And Kailey, you're framing this perfectly, because it does appear that there are those contrasting parameters between the U.S. and Iran on what a potential deal will look like. It is our understanding that this current round of talks is focused just on that nuclear program amid disagreements about how much and whether, if at all, Iran should have domestic enrichment capacity, as well as what will happen to Iran's current stockpile of highly enriched uranium. We're getting some conflicting headlines about what may or may not be a red line for the U.S. there. But we heard from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying that the U.S. also needs to see some of these other critical agenda items put on the table for a potential deal, mainly Iran's ballistic missile program, but also its support for proxy militia groups in the region. And as you well know, deadlines shift a lot here in Washington, but we did hear from President Trump saying that Iran has until next week to reach a deal. And there's definitely the military firepower to back up that threat. You well know that there has just been such an amassing of U.S. military assets in the region, as Israel actually confirmed this morning that the U.S. did move over F-22 fighter jets as well as refueling planes to the country, the first time any such move has been taken. So we have our eyes on all sides of this. The U.S. has not weighed in yet, though we do know that the White House's position has been that diplomacy is the first choice, but potential military action is not off the table.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, live at the White House. Thank you so much. Of course, these talks between the U.S. and Iran, the potential outcome is something financial markets are paying very close attention to, especially perhaps if you're an oil trader, as we consider what military conflict could mean for oil supply coming out of the Middle East. Could you actually see Iran, in retaliation, close off the Strait of Hormuz or attack the energy infrastructure of other U.S. Gulf allies and OPEC producers? These are all within the realm of possibility. And of course, that could have implications for the price per barrel of oil and therefore prices at the pump for Americans. This is actually something we got into yesterday with Republican Senator Steve Daines of Montana. How could this economically impact people here at home? This was his response.
We have decoupled our country from many of the global markets as it relates to oil. We were overly dependent on the Middle East. Today, the United States is the largest producer of oil and oil derivatives in the world, and that helps soften the blows if there is any kind of connectivity going on in Iran. So I'm not as concerned about what happened to oil prices, given the fact that we have done a stellar job, thanks to President Trump and the American energy industry, of becoming much more self-sufficient, and we are now energy dominant. We are an exporter of energy, where once upon a time we were a net importer.
We want to get another take now as we turn here on Bloomberg TV and radio to Bob McNally. He is president and founder of Rapidan Energy Group, also former special assistant and senior director for international energy on the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. Bob, welcome back to Balance of Power. I wonder if you agree with the senator's assessment.
Hi, Kailey. Great to be back. The senator's absolutely correct from a broad macroeconomic perspective, right? The fact that we are an oil exporter means that if we were to see a sudden rise in oil prices, from the perspective of our whole economy, the impact would be less than if we were a big net importer. So our companies, our investors, our industries that employ people producing energy, their value would go up. So it is true at the economic standpoint, broadly. However, as the senator well knows, from the perspective of a voting motorist going to the pump to pay for gasoline, their being a net exporter doesn't help us too much in terms of insulating that consumer from the pump price implications of a crude oil price spike. So it's a bit of a mixed story, but he's correct at the broad economic GDP level.
Okay, so if you were advising this president, as you've advised presidents in the past, Bob, about the implications that taking military action could have for energy specifically, what would you be telling him? How should he be calibrating his moves here with that consideration in mind?
Well, I think the first thing is he has to understand, the president has to understand, there are no quick and easy solutions here. The SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, even if it was full, which it is not, unfortunately, could not offset the loss of Hormuz. That when we think about taking on Iran, it has the capability to disrupt that 20 million barrels a day of crude and some refined products, 20% of LNG, for longer perhaps than people think. It's not going to be the first Gulf War. It's not going to be the second Gulf War when it was over in a few hours to days. It's not going to be nabbing Maduro or even the 12-day war. And so it's the most serious kind of risk you can run. That being said, to be fair, if we defang Iran and we achieve our goals with Iran and Iran is neutralized, the benefits from an energy security standpoint, economic standpoint, and terrorism and security standpoint are enormous. So I would be telling him enormous risks, enormous rewards, and I would be suggesting the priority militarily ought to be to suppress Iran's still intact inventory of mines, missiles, drones, boats, submarines, and other things that could stretch out that interruption of Hormuz, because that is what's really going to hurt the global economy and the U.S. economy if Iran can shut down that waterway.
Well, and so that's when the other Gulf states and other OPEC producers come in here, Bob, because it's not just about a risk-reward calculation for the United States, but our allies in this region as well, who might be worried, what if Iran comes for our infrastructure, actually takes out our capacity for a significant period of time, our ability to actually not just move this stuff through the Strait of Hormuz, but originate it in our countries?
Absolutely. They do not want to see a conventional war, wide-scale war in their region. Look, Saudi Arabia, it suffered about as close a call as you could have in September of 2019 when Iran attacked not only the most important Saudi infrastructure, arguably the most important energy or even economic facility on the planet, the Abqaiq stabilization plant. Now, Iran chose back then to just show what it could do. It didn't destroy it. So Saudi Arabia, UAE, other countries are very vulnerable. So is Iran. If this conflict spreads to attacking each other's above ground energy infrastructure. Kailey, got to be careful with predictions. I'm thinking that's less likely. Saudi Arabia is in a better place with Iran right now. If Iran were to inflict catastrophic damage on Saudi or other facilities, I think the response would be the ending of the Iranian regime. So it would only be something they do in extreme dire straits. It'd probably be the last thing the Iranians did. And so I think the focus will be on raising the price of oil to try to back President Trump off temporarily. And you do that by just stopping the flow through Hormuz, because that's something you can start again once the conflict's over.
Okay, so how far in terms of raising the price of oil realistically do you think we could see in this scenario, Bob? Because right now I'm looking at Brent crude, $72 a barrel. Are we talking triple digits once again? Are we talking 90? Do you have a sense? Yeah, I think on the outbreak of conflict, should that happen, I think we're probably going up another $3 to $5 a barrel easily. We've been telling clients for some time now there's a 75% probability of military escalation. As you mentioned, there's a good $5 to $10 in the price right now, more betting in the options markets. But we think we have a ways to go. So it's probably up 3 to 5. Kailey, I can actually see a relief drop in oil prices as the conflict extends, because the market may think, oh, wait a minute, when the U.S. shoots at an adversary in the Gulf, it wins within hours to days. I hear over and over, oh, the U.S. is going to clean up the Strait of Hormuz in days. I think that's mistaken. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a spike and then a reversal. But I think if Iran chose, and our military advisors tell us, if Iran chose to make the Hormuz Strait unsafe, it could do so for weeks. Sort of like back in April when the Houthis absorbed 52 days of
pummeling by the U.S. military,
Right.
and we did not stop them from making Bab el-Mandab unsafe. Iran has much better weaponry, better coastline than the Houthis. So I can almost see spikes and reversals here. And if it gets to a prolonged Hormuz disruption, well over $100 a barrel, it'll have to cause demand destruction through economic downturn.
Wow, that's incredible to consider, Bob. It's so valuable to have you weighing in on this potential conflict. But I also want to ask you about some other areas as well, as of course we're seeing another escalation in at the very least rhetoric around our relationship with Cuba, and of course the U.S. Playing a more active role now in choking off Cuban supplies, including that of energy. Bloomberg is now out with a story that's just crossed a red headline on the Bloomberg terminal about the Trump administration aiming to make Cuba more dependent on the United States for supplies. Apparently this plan would include reassuring energy companies that they can sell oil and fuel to Cuban businesses, and authorizing the resale of Venezuelan oil to Cuba under certain conditions. I know you're hearing this news just as it's breaking, and I'm reading it to you, Bob, but I wonder if you have a thought as to whether or not Cuba can actually become a real market for American energy, what this would entail.
Absolutely. No, I think the Trump administration, it began with Venezuela, but I think its vision of ejecting foreign influence, adversarial influence in our hemisphere, and confronting and defeating regimes in the region that are hostile to the United States is underway, and Cuba's probably next after Venezuela. That being said, I don't think you're going to see as an aggressive approach to Cuba as you do with Venezuela. I don't think the administration, Marco Rubio, the president, want to cause a humanitarian crisis in Cuba. In some ways, it's even more vulnerable than many other countries in the region. So I think, and the Russians are sending a boat there. I don't think we want to have another Cuban crisis with Russia. So I don't think we're necessarily in a huge hurry. And I think they're going to be toggling things and calibrating pressure and inducements. But I think they see that the trend is toward pushing Cuba to come closer to the United States. And so I think that maybe is reflected in this sort of balanced policy and balanced announcement you're seeing.
Well, and of course, Venezuela is tied into this as well. And you mentioned it, Bob. What role is the Venezuelan oil that the U.S. is now selling playing in the global market right now? What kind of a factor is it?
It's a big factor, but for a small part of the market. If you're a complex refiner and you love to slurp, if you will, to consume Venezuela's gunky, heavy, sulfurous, poisonous oil, you'll love it. It's a huge deal because you couldn't get this really. It was all going to China. So if you're a Chinese competitor with the United States refiner, you're not happy. If you're a U.S. refiner that likes this stuff, your Christmas just keeps on rolling on for you. It's wonderful. But the overall volumes measured in the hundreds of thousands of barrels a day are a drop in the bucket in the broader global oil market. What's happening in Iran is much more important. What's happening in Russia is much more important than is happening in Venezuela in terms of the broad market. It's more of a niche of the market, this supply and demand for this very healthy, heavy sulfurous crude.
All right, Bob, we so appreciate it. A voice of expertise on this sector and how it ties into these many geopolitical dynamics we are facing right now. Thank you so much. Bob McNally, founder and president of the Rapidan Energy Group, and again, former special assistant and senior director for international energy on the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. Now, regarding those talks between the U.S. and Iran, which again are underway in Geneva, a third round today, we do have some fresh reporting out, this from Axios, that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who of course are the two U.S. envoys who are charged with leading these talks, were disappointed by the morning session. Remember, there was talks this morning, then they took a break and returned for a second session. And according to Axios, that evening session is still ongoing. So these negotiations are still underway. But again, Witkoff and Kushner apparently disappointed by what they heard from the Iranians earlier today. We'll continue to follow this story for you, and we'll have more with our political panel coming up next, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Of course, if it's Thursday, that means we're 2 days post President Trump's State of the Union address, which, as we all anticipated, focused at least in part on the issue of affordability, casting blame on Democrats for the higher prices Americans are experiencing even more than a year after the presidency of Joe Biden came to an end, and also pointing to areas in which prices have come down since President Trump took office. It's a message that he delivered to the millions of people who tuned in for at least part of that almost 2-hour-long speech on Tuesday night, but it's a message now that the administration is taking on the road, not just via President Trump, but other surrogates, including today, Vice President J.D. Vance, who made travel to Wisconsin, actually just wrapping up a speech at a machining facility in Plover, Wisconsin, doing his best to sell the Trump economic agenda, answering questions there from local media, including around the president's tariffs, which he says are aimed at helping Americans. And we want to bring the panel in on this as we turn now to Rick Davis, who, of course, is a Republican strategist, partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Bloomberg politics contributor, joined today by Meghan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. Rick, I'd love to get your take on just J.D. Vance as the messenger here, with his upbringing, with his populist bona fides. Is he actually one of the better people to sell this economy, this Trump economy, to the public?
Yeah, I would say, just as a note, I think that part of what the administration is doing better this year than it did a year ago is sending the cabinet, is sending the vice president out on these tours around the country to promote the message that the president delivered on Tuesday. So kudos to the administration for getting their organizational act together and realizing in a competitive midterm, they've really got you got to work it extra hard. Yes, J.D. Vance in the Midwest is a commodity that's worth selling. He's got a lot of popularity in Ohio and Minnesota, not necessarily Minneapolis, and Wisconsin. And so, yes, I mean, there's going to be some competitive races there, and having him present there is going to help the Republican turnout.
Well, so if he might be a better person to sell the message, Meghan, I do wonder about the message itself that they're trying to sell. You obviously worked for a president that tried and really struggled to say my economy is better, at least statistically, via the data, then you might feel that it is. We know that dogged Joe Biden for much of his presidency and his reelection campaign, while there was one. And it seems President Trump is in the same position now. How do you sell the idea of affordability to an electorate that is still saying, at least to pollsters, things are too expensive?
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. He's going into Wisconsin, where they've lost 2,200 manufacturing jobs since Donald Trump took office. They've already laid off 4,000 people in their workforce, and 16 family farms, which is a 700% increase from 2024, have declared bankruptcy. That's not happening because the economy is doing well and these tariffs are helping them. They are a direct impact, and they are a tax on people in their state, and they're losing jobs, and their economy is suffering because of it. So J.D. Vance can go there and try to spin all of Donald Trump's narratives and the administration's policies. But the fact of the matter is, people in Wisconsin, just like along with the rest of the country, really feel it in their pocketbooks when they can't afford things. So they can go there and give speeches, but it does not change that people still can't afford things. And the numbers don't lie. When people's increase in electricity goes up and they can't afford to pay it, that is a real problem for a lot of the American people.
Well, it's obviously a problem that J.D. Vance is trying to tackle today, or at least message his way around. But it's not just that J.D. Vance is up to, Rick, because as of Tuesday night, when the president announced it mid-State of the Union, apparently J.D. Vance is also helping to lead the war on fraud, a war that he launched yesterday by announcing a pause on federal Medicaid reimbursements to Minnesota. Is this an assignment that J.D. Vance, as we consider not just J.D. Vance, the vice president, but J.D. Vance, the potential 2028 presidential candidate, is this an assignment that he can make work for him?
Yeah, it's a bit of an insider deal. MAGA has been obsessed with this, situation in Minnesota. It's been highly circulated around MAGA social media, platforms. And I would say, from what I've seen in the numbers, has not broken into sort of the popular nationwide discussion. The president put it on the agenda Tuesday. I think if J.D. Vance is looking to pursue a presidential race in 28 and wants to be the darling of the MAGA movement, then, yeah, it makes sense that he'd want to own this. But I think that from a broader perspective, I can't disagree that unless you're talking about affordability, in a place like Wisconsin, especially today, then you're missing the mark on what the messaging is. And so, great that he's going to do it. I think it helps him with the base of the MAGA movement. But is that going to change any votes leading up to the midterms? No. And frankly, a lot of his prospects for national office in the future are tied to their ability to not have a bloodbath in November of this year. And so I'm not sure I'd spend a lot of time talking about fraud unless it's directly related to what the price of bacon is.
Well, Meghan, I'd love for you to weigh in on that idea of the 2028 prospects as well. I know we're a long way out from that, but it seems that President Trump keeps playing into this, oh, who will I pick kind of narrative on J.D. Vance, the vice president, and Marco Rubio, the secretary of state. And it was not Vance that really was applauded by the president out of the State of the Union, but Marco Rubio, who was called out for his efforts diplomatically on a variety of fronts. And at least half of the room stood for him at that point. Where do you come down on this idea of Vance versus Rubio? And the two, of course, are reportedly very good friends.
It will be interesting to see how it sort of plays out. I think that part of this fraud assignment is that J.D. Vance needs something to do, and he needs something that he can actually try to tackle as vice president, because normally the vice president handles a lot of foreign policy. That's what we did when Joe Biden was the vice president. We traveled all over the world and really held the diplomatic core and those negotiations. But Marco Rubio is clearly much more effective at doing that. We saw that in Munich this year. J.D. Vance kind of went there and made a disgrace, had a lot of mess that the United States had to then clean up. But Marco Rubio went, said very similar things, but his tone was different and he is received much differently abroad. So it's sort of interesting to see how it plays. I just think that Marco Rubio has more of an opportunity to show the American people what he can do diplomatically, and that he's already been a senator. He seems to be a much better candidate, and J.D. Vance will always be tied to Donald Trump's economic policies, where Marco Rubio gets to sort of distance himself from the domestic policy. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, but I don't think J.D. Vance has a really good shot unless they can clean up the economy and people really feel it.
Well, on the issue of the economy and of affordability, obviously housing plays a role in that. And we understand that the New York City mayor, Zohran Mamdani, is meeting with President Trump at the White House today to discuss housing, keeping in mind that the president also talked about Mamdani in his State of the Union address on Tuesday. Here's a reminder.
And even the new communist mayor of New York City, I think he's a nice guy, actually. Speak to him a lot. Bad policy, but nice guy. Just said they want people to shovel snow. They got hit hard.
He says he speaks to him a lot, Rick, apparently speaking to him in person at the White House today. According to Bloomberg's reporting, and this is via sources familiar with the matter, they're expected to focus on housing development in New York City, specifically discussing ways the city can pave the way for more big projects. Are you surprised to see this kind of collaboration between a Republican president and someone he's describing as a communist?
Any Republican president, yes. This Republican president, no. Donald Trump seems to always fall in love with those he hates the most. And obviously said a lot of really tough things about Mamdani before the election. Mamdani came to Washington, met with the president, and you thought he was his new adopted son. It's quite a turnaround. But look, I mean, at the end of the day, I think even for Donald Trump, these policies that Mamdani's promoting in New York City, especially a $100 billion plan to build 200,000 union-produced housing units, is more than Donald Trump can swallow. Mamdani needs the federal government. He won't have that opportunity to get money out of the state in an election year. And so if he wants to make good on his promises, he's got to find a benefactor. And why not go to the biggest person in the world, and that's in Washington.
And I should note that it's actually Politico reporting that we're leaning on here. Meghan, please weigh in on this as well. If you're Mamdani, having just kind of ridden this incredible wave to the mayor, to become the mayor of New York City, with this very specific message to a Democratic base, specifically the left side of the Democratic Party, how does it play optically for you to be working closely with this president that Democrats clearly are not a fan of?
I mean, I think it plays well for him. He's doing what he needs to do to get things done for his city, and that's exactly what our elected officials should do. They should cross party lines and work with people to get it done. I do think it's problematic for Donald Trump and the fact that he's taking the wind out of the sails of all the Republicans that are trying to paint Mamdani as a boogeyman by working with him, inviting him to the White House, and having these jovial conversations. So, it's interesting because the whole Republican Party is trying to make the whole country believe that everyone is Mamdani and everyone is a communist and it's going to be like New York City, when it's just, that's just not true, as we all know. So the more that Trump cozies up to him and they become buddy-buddy, I think it's just bad politically for Trump and Republicans. I don't think it impacts Democrats at all.
Well, and when we consider the issue specifically today that they're discussing, this one of housing, Meghan, is this an area in which Democrats and Republicans, to your point on working together for the betterment of your constituency, is this going to be one of the few bipartisan areas of compromise, perhaps even legislative effort, that we see in this midterm year? Is housing basically as good as it gets if you're looking for progress on something?
I mean, I would sure hope so. Housing is extremely unaffordable for people. There isn't enough rental homes for people to live in. So I do think it is a major issue, and it's not just impacting cities, it's impacting small communities as well. So it is something that I would hope that people could work bipartisan on, because it does impact literally every single person needs a place to live. So I just, if there's one issue that we could cross the lines on, I always thought it'd be healthcare, but I guess housing will have to do.
All right, Meghan Hayes and Rick Davis, our political panel today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do want to bring our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio up to date on what we're watching in Geneva. Of course, talks between the U.S. and Iran that are being mediated by Oman. And Oman is now saying that the talks have finished for today and that the talks made significant progress. Again, it's the mediator that's saying that. We'll see what the readout is from the United States and from Iran, whether enough progress was made to avoid military action. For now, we'll have more ahead right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Incredible to see that 5% downward move on NVIDIA, despite what arguably was a pretty good quarter and a pretty good forecast. I guess just pretty good is a relative term if you're a market that already was jittery about the sustainability of the various parts of the AI trade. And of course, if you're looking at a company that already boasts a valuation like NVIDIA does. We want to get more into this and other AI stories that we're watching from here in Washington as we turn to Michael Shepard, Bloomberg Senior Editor for Technology and Strategic Industries. Mike, I want to ask you specifically about Anthropic in a moment, but if we could just zero in on NVIDIA, to what extent is this really about NVIDIA versus about how everybody seems to be just overly jittery around AI right now?
There is a lot of fear and loathing in the market, and this is yet another symptom of it. Part of it, Kailey, really stems from the overarching question, which we've been asking in conversations with you and Joe, even in this space, about the utility of this technology. How will it ultimately be applied by companies over the long haul? And at the core for NVIDIA is the question of how long will the infrastructure demand be there? Now, the company insisted on its conference call that, look, we have demand for additional compute that's, as far as the eye can see, it's growing exponentially. The hyperscalers need our chips by the bushel, and we do not see any decrease in that. And in fact, their forecast certainly showed that with it exceeding expectations and projections from investors, that they really do expect a lot of growth. But we do see other analysts questioning whether, for the long term, past, say, 2027, it will continue at the same pace. And then we also see the questions surrounding, some of their purchase commitments that Michael Burry raised, and his voice certainly does cause some jitters, too.
Oh, indeed it does, of Big Short fame. I also want to talk about Anthropic because we are coming up on a deadline that Anthropic is facing from the Pentagon. 5:01 p.m. tomorrow, they have to decide whether or not they're going to comply with the government's desires as to how Anthropic's technology, and Claude specifically, can be used by the DoD. Do we have a sense, as they're threatened with perhaps the Defense Production Act being invoked or being labeled a supply chain risk, as to whether or not Anthropic is getting closer to acquiescing to the Pentagon's demands?
Well, Kailey, that really is the core question. And we just saw from the Pentagon spokesman, Sean Parnell, really the line in the sand from the Defense Department. And that is that they do not want any company dictating the terms of how they use this technology. And the Pentagon insisted, look, we will use the technology from Anthropic or any other company within the bounds of the law, A. B, we will not do mass surveillance. It's illegal. Sean Parnell, the spokesman, insisted and put in his post on X. And yet for Anthropic, they really do want that belt and suspenders assurance. And that has been a red line on the surveillance question and on the fully autonomous weapons question. And our sense from the company is that there really is no more ground to give. Whether or not the two sides can at least agree in some fashion, saying that, look, we believe that you will abide by our usage policy. Or the Pentagon says, sure, we accept your usage policy based on what each side seems to be saying. But there is a question about application and how it actually works in the moment. If there is any moment where the technology may balk and not do what the Pentagon wants, that is really the core of it right here.
So should we be reading into at all the idea that Anthropic yesterday broadly dropped its safety pledge? Is that a kind of signal that, okay, we are rethinking how we want to consider guardrails around our technology?
Well, that is a great question, because a lot of people were starting to read that as potentially a move that would allow this dispute with the Pentagon to pass. But really, that safety pledge applies to Anthropic's own development of technology, and that it has long vowed to avoid pursuing AI technology that could be potentially dangerous. They've relaxed that slightly, saying that, look, we may go after AI tech that may be potentially dangerous if we sense a competitive disadvantage brewing. The other actually applies to their usage policy, and that is customers. So if you and I were using Claude, or in this case, the Pentagon, Claude Gov, we have to abide by certain terms. And those are the terms that they're trying to get the Pentagon to sign off on. And the Pentagon is saying, look, we don't want any strings attached or terms attached to our usage.
And again, the deadline is tomorrow, so I would imagine we'll be talking to you again
then.
We'll
be back again in this
Michael
space.
Shepard, thank you so much. Now, I also want to keep you abreast of breaking news that is just crossing the terminal a few moments ago as we watch talks that were taking place today in Geneva between the U.S. and Iran, mediated by Oman. Oman now saying that there was progress made in the talks today, which have wrapped up, and there will be more technical talks that take place next week in Vienna. That they will be continuing at a technical level. We're actually seeing a little bit of movement in oil off the back of this off-session highs on both Brent and WTI. We're trading at $71 a barrel on Brent, $65 roughly on WTI right now. But we also know that in Geneva today, it wasn't just talks between the U.S. and Iran. There were also talks taking place between the U.S. and representatives from Ukraine. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the president's envoy, is very busy once again in Switzerland, after we know that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, spoke by phone with President Trump yesterday to talk about these talks in Geneva today and how they could set the stage for potential trilateral talks in early March between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. Of course, the war in Ukraine, as of Tuesday, has entered its fifth year, Tuesday marking 4 years since Russia invaded, and Tuesday marking the State of the Union address from President Trump, where he did talk about this conflict.
We're working very hard to end the ninth war, the killing and slaughter between Russia and Ukraine, where 25,000 soldiers are dying each and every month. A war which would have never happened if I were president. Would have never happened. As president, I will make peace wherever I can, but I will never hesitate to confront threats to America wherever we must.
That is the only thing the president said, mind you, about Ukraine and this war in the State of the Union address. But we want to get into this now with Angela Stent. She is senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also author of Putin's World, Against the West and With the Rest. Angela, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to have you. As we hear the president say once again that he would prefer to see peace, he wants diplomacy to potentially prevail here. Are we getting any closer to a diplomatic resolution to this conflict?
We are no closer to a diplomatic resolution than we were when President Trump was inaugurated in January of 25. The real problem is that Russia is engaging in what I would call performative negotiations. Putin doesn't want to annoy President Trump. He doesn't want any more sanctions on Russia. And therefore, the Russians pretend that they're really interested in ending the war. But they have not modified their maximal demands on Ukraine since these negotiations began. And those terms are unacceptable for Ukraine if it wants to remain an independent sovereign state.
Well, and certainly they're not slowing down their military action either overnight. Russia keeping up with his attacks, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, launching 420 drones, 39 missiles on 8 different regions of Ukraine, partially targeting energy infrastructure, injuring dozens, including children. Angela, does that actually tell us kind of everything we need to know about where Russia is right now?
I really think it does. And Russia has been increasing its attacks and bombardment, both of the Ukrainian energy infrastructure and civilian targets in the last year. And every time there are some more negotiations, this time just between the US and Ukraine, but even when there were trilateral negotiations with Russia, these bombardments increased. And Putin has again said, we're nowhere near to ending this war. And so, the best I think that the Ukrainians can hope for today in Geneva is to get assurances from the United States about what they call a prosperity package, which will be economic investment in Ukraine, but that's once the war is over. And otherwise, Zelensky has said that there will probably be, as you said, trilateral negotiations again in March. But the last time there were those negotiations, the Russians sent as their chief negotiator someone who really doesn't have that much power and was mainly there to, again, give the false narrative about Putin, which Putin has many times given, which is that Ukraine is really part of Russia.
Well, so who, if we are to see another set of trilateral negotiations, who would Russia need to send for you to see it as credible, as actually being in good faith?
So I think they would have to go back to where they were before, which is to send the head of their military intelligence agency as the chief negotiator, but then also someone like Yuri Ushakov, who is President Putin's main foreign policy advisor. And he was present at the very beginning at some of the discussions with the United States, but he hasn't been seen since then negotiating with the Ukrainians. So I think that would be one signal. But I think the main signal would be if Russia really were willing to stop its bombardment and to show some good faith that it wants to achieve a ceasefire, and at the moment it's not interested in that.
Well, and to get back to what you were mentioning earlier, this idea that there is a fundamental disconnect between Russia's objectives and what Ukraine is willing to agree to, issues of Ukrainian sovereign territory, which Russia obviously does not view that way, Angela. How can we possibly come to an agreement on that ever, regardless of who is sent to the negotiating table?
Well, I think the problem is as long as you have President Putin in power, and as long as the Russians are insisting that Ukraine has to give territory to Russia in eastern Ukraine, which Russia doesn't control, it's going to be very, very difficult to come to any agreement. One could theoretically at least say there's a ceasefire and there won't be any more attacks at the moment. The Ukrainians have said that they would be willing to have a demilitarized zone in the area that Russia wants Ukraine to give up, but the Russians have rejected that. If you could have a ceasefire, then you could at least think about what comes afterwards. But the Russians are now saying no ceasefire until Ukraine has made all these concessions. And the Ukrainians are saying they have to have some credible security guarantees from the Europeans with a backup from the United States in order for them to also agree to a ceasefire.
Well, so are the Europeans doing and promising enough here, Angela, or they simply can't do it enough on their own?
I mean, they're promising, some countries are promising as much as they can. The British, the French, the Germans, some other countries are willing to send some troops into Western Ukraine as a security guarantee, but that's only once the war is over. But I think everyone agrees without a U.S. backstop, and that would mean continued U.S. intelligence support for Ukraine, but also some kind of insurance that if the Russians then attacked again, the U.S. would be involved also in pushing back. And the Trump administration hasn't agreed to do that yet. And the Europeans, I think, by themselves, without U.S. backing, it would be very difficult for them to provide the security guarantees to Ukraine that Ukraine would need in order to deter Russia. That's the key question. How could you then deter Russia from relaunching an invasion once it had recouped some of its military?
We just have 30 seconds left, Angela, but where would you put the odds that we're still having a conversation about an ongoing war at this time next year when we mark 5 years?
I would say the odds, unfortunately, are rather high that we'll be still discussing this in a year.
All right, Angela, we always appreciate you joining us with your expertise. As somber as this conversation is, Angela Stent, of course, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest, weighing in on one set of high-stakes talks in Geneva today, the other, of course, being those between the U.S. and Iran, which the mediator, Oman, says has wrapped. We're making progress, and more technical talks will be taking place in Vienna next week. We'll have more analysis of that on the late edition of Balance of Power. Well, Joe Matthew will be with me once again from New York. So we'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and Radio.